I'm Sarah Maslin Nir of The New York Times, sitting in for Sam Roberts. Welcome to The New York Times Close-Up. In President Trump's first year back in office, mass deportations, aggressive ICE enforcement, and a new threat to cut off funds to sanctuary cities have put immigration back in the center of American politics. But first, Governor Kathy Hochul used this year's State of the State to hammer on affordability, tout lower utility and insurance bills, and lean into tech regulation, and even advance nuclear power as answers to voter anxiety. She also moved to restrict protests around religious buildings and sent more signals about how she wants to handle crime, housing, and migration heading into a tough election year. Joining us to break down what it all means is New York Times reporter Ben Oreskes, who's been covering Hochul and New York politics. Welcome, Ben.
Thanks for having me.
A pleasure. Thank you. The State of the State was far-reaching, wide-ranging, a lot of stuff she touched on. Can you give us maybe what the 3 or 4 big themes were?
Of course, it's a 47-minute speech where she is laying out her priorities for the year. What will quickly follow is an executive budget proposal that will sort of set the tone for the legislative session. And in this speech, we heard a lot about the issues that are giving voters in this state anxiety, as you said, as she heads into an election year. So we heard a lot about affordability. We heard a lot about anger around Trump. And we heard a lot about, a broader effort on her part to make the state more hospitable to business and make it a competitive place to work and do business.
So let's talk about affordability. It's a big part of my beat. It's a big part of everybody's beat because it's the issue. In the office, we were having a big debate about what the name of a new affordability column might be yesterday, you might remember. And I think we landed on broke city. That's how it feels sometimes to be here. How is Hochul tackling that sentiment? Can you give us some of the proposals?
Her and the newly inaugurated Mayor Zohran Mamdani, who they couldn't have more different backgrounds, have aligned on the issue of childcare. We heard a ton about it during his election. And it's an issue that Ms. Hochul has been focused on for years, putting billions of dollars into the state budget to expand childcare options here in New York. This year, we heard Hochul talk a lot about this in her speech, and also in the weeks since Mamdani has been inaugurated. She's announced a roadmap to create universal childcare in the state. We are not going to get there in year one. We heard about a $1.7 billion investment to allow Mamdani to start pilots for 2K, expand 3K options, and then also expand vouchers and other forms of childcare in other parts of the state. So again, an enormous amount of money going into, to try to bring down the cost of one of the biggest expenses for many New Yorkers. It's an issue that we've heard about a ton in the paper and seen it on the streets. Families talking about how they might have to leave New York because it's so expensive to take care of your children.
And one of the interesting federal moves that I covered last week, my colleague Joe Goldstein, was that Trump has frozen or cut off subsidies to childcare for the most impoverished people, sort of responsive to what's happening in Minnesota, the big fraud uncovered there, saying to a bunch of Democratic states, we bet you have fraud too. And Hochul has pushed back pretty forcefully against that. How much of Hochul's decision-making in the State of the State is responsive to what's happening federally?
An enormous amount. The state gets close to $100 billion every year from the federal government in the form of subsidies, reimbursements. So, when it's $3 billion here, another $5 billion here in another spot, it really does affect how they plan. And also, they are trying to fill a void. So when $3 billion is cut, they are trying to fill that hole. And then also on a rhetorical level, she's trying to frame herself as someone who's protecting the interests of vulnerable people, protecting immigrants, protecting poor people. And as you mentioned, that $3 billion freezing of funds, she and the Attorney General, Letitia James, have been very aggressive about going to court and pushing back against these moves. They've won a lot of these cases, or at least been successful in many of them. And I think you see the sort of marrying of two ideas. You have this affordability agenda that her and many other Democratic politicians are trying to push. And they're also trying to be, a bulwark against the Republicans in Washington. And both ideas are extremely potent with Democratic voters who are, very upset about what they're seeing in Washington and how the policies of President Trump are playing out across the country.
And, we have a trope in the city, the rent is too damn high. One of her proposals is a rent freeze, and Zohran Mamdani has vowed to be the renters' mayor, the tenants' mayor. Can you talk about the rental freeze proposal for seniors that she talked about?
Yeah, I mean, it's one of several initiatives where she's trying to find a way without, hurting small landlords and making it harder to grow the amount of housing in the state and city, ways to help poor people. We also saw her talk about trying to drive down the cost of auto insurance, utility bills. Another sort of maybe more esoteric but very significant thing is the environmental review process for building. She's trying to streamline that, which will anger many environmentalists in certain parts of the state. But again, taken together, these are all a recognition that the things that cost the most money here in New York are housing, childcare, and utility costs, food costs, and things like that stress people out. And she wants to be seen as someone who's doing something about this.
You mentioned food costs. A recent study just a few days ago is that food costs are persistently increased despite inflation being somewhat stable. One of the subjects that I cover are how people in the poorest members of the city get food, and SNAP is a huge part of that, having subsidized money to purchase the bare necessities. There's a huge problem that you may be aware of with your SNAP card of skimming, which is a way that people steal money from people who use these cards. They put skim readers on different machines at bodegas, at supermarkets. It costs millions and millions of dollars, and until about a month ago, the federal government reimbursed you if you got your money stolen. And that has created a sort of stasis with these cards, allowing this fraud to perpetuate. That got cut off, and I think Hochul announced yesterday that they're going to start making these cards more resilient to fraud. It's a change, making them a chip reader card, which people have been advocating for years. Have you heard about this? It's a seismic shift in how New York is going to enforce this tremendous fraud.
Yeah, and I mean, I think for Hochul, she's got two parts to her, in many ways. She wants to be seen as someone who is caring for, the least, the people with the least, but also someone who is thinking about efficiency, is thinking about trying to, be an honest broker with, a very progressive, angry electorate, and also a person who is there talking to a more moderate, business-minded community as well. So when you hear her talk about things like fraud, she's looking for ways to tackle those issues without demonizing poor people, but also, making sure the budget isn't turned upside down.
Got it. And let's move on to immigration. It's a huge topic right now. We're seeing ICE picking people up at our courthouses. Even a member of the City Hall staff was recently arrested by ICE, which we'll get into later in the program. I want to understand, how is she responding as the leader of a sanctuary state to the agitation from the federal government?
Absolutely. It's worth pointing out with Ms. Hochul, she's from Buffalo. She is someone who doesn't come to immigration like many of the downstate politicians who are more, progressive. She is someone who, when she was a local politician in Buffalo, opposed driver's license for undocumented immigrants. And so she has sort of been resistant to a lot of the more aggressive moves around, cooperating with ICE in certain regards. In this budget, or in this speech, we heard from her talk a lot about her anger about this killing in Minneapolis, and also sort of talk about her support for new legislation that would give New Yorkers, recourse to sue ICE agents in state courts for civil rights violation. So that's one example of her trying to meet a moment where people are so angry about how the many New Yorkers who don't necessarily have status are living in this city, and it's a recognition that there's been a shift in thinking on this on her part.
Very interesting. So one of the things that may have gone a little unnoticed under these big shifts is a smaller move to to limit protest around religious sites. Can you talk about this, and what's that about? It seems a little out of nowhere in a state of the state.
Yeah, it was an interesting proposal, and one that has had a lot of support from Jewish legislators. we have seen in New York a lot of protests outside of synagogues. Many have felt that these made people who were going to synagogue or going to events at synagogues feel unsafe. Often the people protesting were, angry about the politics of the people who are inside these synagogues. And there's also been viral videos of people saying anti-Semitic things at these protests. All of this taken together has led Hochul to believe that there should be a buffer zone essentially around religious institutions, 25 feet, give people the space to enter, exit, whether it's a synagogue or a church. And notably, this would apply to some medical facilities as well, I think, with an eye towards protests around abortion. But again, I think this is her trying to speak to the very large Jewish community in New York that is deeply divided, and many who are upset about the sort of tenor of debate around what is happening in the Middle East right now.
With the limited time we have left, let's end on a hopeful note that there's a lot of thought and talk about innovation and ways to make the state business-friendly and innovation-friendly. Can you list a few of those?
Yeah, I mean, Hochul has poured a lot of money in recent years into investments in artificial intelligence. She has done a lot as well to sort of think about how people are engaging online. And, in this speech, we saw her talk about protections for children who are interacting on gaming sites and ensuring their safety. And we saw her talk a lot about, expanding hubs for AI research and universities where this kind of research is going on. So, I mean, I think in that you saw an awareness on her part about how the economy of the state is changing and a desire to not be left in the lurch and not fall behind a place like California, where a lot of this research is also going on.
And how do you see the city and the state interacting? Mayor Mamdani went to Albany for the State of the State, as did every politician. What is their interplay going to be going forward?
Yeah, I mean, again, very different backgrounds, the two of them. He's half her age. And he was very inexperienced coming into this job and came in with a very muscular, aggressive view of the world. He wanted higher taxes. He wanted free and fast buses. He wanted universal childcare. And interestingly, throughout his election, we saw her endorse him, but in those months, we've also seen a kind of looming rapport between them. And in their announcement last week about universal childcare, in this speech, we saw Hochul talk a lot about their partnership. And I think some people have been surprised how much affinity they have for one another and how they are both willing to kind of meet in the middle because they see it serving both of their political ends and also helping the state. And so for Mamdani, that means he's been less vocal about taxes and increasing them. He's not been critical of her for holding the line on that issue. And on her end, she's talked a lot about her disagreements with him over things like Israel and Zionism, but that has not stopped her from working with him on issues like childcare. So again, I think they have sort of become this model of how people can work together in moments like this. The question is, will it last as the real challenge of negotiating these budgets, negotiating the gritty details of it, and unforeseen events come together. I think for both of them, they hope that they can continue to have a working relationship, unlike other mayors and governors. But that sort of remains to be seen.
Thanks so much, Ben. Coming up next, Trump's nationwide ICE crackdown and what it looks like on the ground here in New York. In President Trump's first year back in office, the U.S. has deported more than 500,000 people. ICE is showing up in New York courts, neighborhoods, and even city government. And Trump is now threatening to cut off money to sanctuary cities as Mayor Zohran Mamdani vows to fight back. Joining me now to discuss is New York Times immigration reporter Luis Ferré Sadurní. Welcome.
Thank you for having me.
So it's been a big week nationally for ICE news for immigration. There's protests in Minneapolis, but here at home, we're not immune to it. Not even the city council is immune to what's happening nationally. Can you explain the latest, what happened just 2 days ago to a member of city council staff?
Yeah, on Tuesday, we got the news that a city council staff member who's Venezuelan was detained by ICE. It was the first city council employee to be detained by ICE under this administration, and it led to an outcry from local Democrats. The city council speaker came out and did a last-minute press conference to sort of denounce the arrest, and it seems like this individual, this employee, was a data analyst. He had been working for a year in city council and was arrested by ICE when he showed up for an asylum interview on Long Island. So it was newsworthy in the sense that, this is the first known account of a city council employee being detained by ICE. But it was also a continuation of what we've been seeing since last year. ICE has been detaining people at check-ins, at asylum claim hearings and interviews. And so it seems like 2026 won't be any different in that sense.
I want to get a little into the nitty-gritty of what exactly happened. So is the city council employing an undocumented immigrant, or what the heck happened here?
Yeah, there's been differing accounts in terms of his immigration status. It seems he had TPS, which is temporary protected status. It's a humanitarian parole program that Biden extended to Venezuelans to shield them from deportation temporarily. But there's conflicting accounts as to whether that protection that he had expired or not. But it seems like at one point he did have authorization to live in the United States and work in the United States. The city council argues he was authorized to work here and live here until October of this year. ICE is arguing that he did not, like his protections had expired. So he's now detained. His lawyers filed a petition to try to get him released. So this will undoubtedly make its way through the courts, and we'll see how it ends up.
And I think there's something interesting here is that he's Venezuelan. We have a saying in the newsroom, all news is local news, right? I mean, there's huge issues happening with Venezuela. How are Venezuelan immigrants, documented or otherwise, feeling in New York right now, given what's happening internationally?
Yeah, I mean, there was hundreds of thousands of Venezuelans who entered the U.S. over the past few years under Biden, right? And with Maduro's capture, and Maduro is now sitting in a jail in Brooklyn, not too far away. There was joy from some Venezuelans who had fled his regime and were happy to see him detained. But there's a lot of uncertainty about what it means for the future of Venezuela. Just because Maduro is not there doesn't mean that the regime and the government in Venezuela has changed. A lot of Venezuelans are still seeking, a democratic transition in the country. And there's a lot of questions about, what happens next in Venezuela. So for Venezuelans who are here, I think there's maybe a want to go back to their country, perhaps not right now. And in the meantime, the Trump administration hasn't changed its tactics and approach towards Venezuelan immigrants. They're still deporting Venezuelans. They still revoked TPS, right? The program I mentioned earlier. And in fact, DHS, the Department of Homeland Security, came out and said that, now that Maduro was gone, it was good for Venezuelans to leave the country and self-deport voluntarily, head home, get out of here. So yeah, there's a lot of mixed emotions there and still a lot of questions to be answered.
So I'm interested in the tactics that are being used to deport people. Is it different than in past years? I think there's been a surge, right, of ICE at courts. Can you talk about this? Some people say it's a more humane way and safer, controlled way to pick up undocumented immigrants. Other people say it's a trap. What's happening at New York City courts in terms of ICE? Yeah,
since last summer, what we've seen is the main tool ICE has used in New York to detain immigrants is showing up at the immigration courthouses in downtown Manhattan and basically detaining folks who are going there for their asylum claim hearings or deportation proceedings, and just basically having them come to them and detaining them and taking them away. ICE argues that this is a convenient way to apprehend people they're looking out for. Advocates and immigration activists argue that it's a deceptive practice, that it's undermining due process. So a lot of the immigration enforcement in New York has been focused in the courts. We've seen an uptick in the same thing happening with what's called ICE check-ins. It's immigrants being summoned to ICE offices to check in and then being detained. And then perhaps it hasn't made the news as much, but we're also seeing ICE out on the streets in immigrant neighborhoods in New York, especially in Queens, Jackson Heights, and Corona. Almost every day there's a tip or a report of an ICE sighting. These are not large-scale raids like what we're seeing in Chicago and Minneapolis. It's sort of more targeted enforcement, smaller scale arrests, but it's happening on a daily, weekly basis.
And are these laborers, people waiting in the parking lot of Home Depot for jobs, that kind of thing?
That we haven't seen as much of that in New York, right? Where we saw in LA, for example, Home Depot parking lots were like prime targets. What we're seeing out in the neighborhoods in New York is one, ICE going to specific homes, looking after specific people on their radar. But then once they show up, or as they're conducting those operations, they're also arresting people who were around the target in the vicinity, who might not have a criminal record but are undocumented, and they're also getting swept up. And we've also seen reports, just to finish it off here, we've also seen reports of ICE detaining people while walking on sidewalks. And it seems like random arrests, seems like they've been denounced as racial profiling. And again, all this has happened at a smaller scale, a little bit out of view. The courts and the immigration offices have still been sort of where the brunt of the activity has been happening.
I want to get into how our new mayor is approaching this and his take and response, but I want to first, let's get a definition of a sanctuary city. New York is one of those. Can you describe it sort of succinctly?
Yeah. Sanctuary city it's not even a legal definition. It's not like a legal status. It's sort of a label used to define cities or localities that have implemented local laws and policies that prohibit local officials, local police, and jails from cooperating with ICE.
Okay.
And so in New York City, for example, the local jails here, like Rikers Island, won't easily transfer immigrants detained there to ICE custody, right? We can get into it a bit more if you want, but that's sort of the...
Well, Trump recently vowed to cut off federal funding across the board to sanctuary cities. That was just a few days ago. What's happening with that?
Yeah, he made that threat earlier this week. He said, I think that starting in February, he wanted to cut off funding. That will almost surely be challenged in the courts. He tried this during his first term. But the administration's view is that so-called sanctuary cities and localities are obstructing immigration law enforcement. They're being uncooperative in violation of federal law, while localities argue that they're within their rights to not have to cooperate with ICE and the federal government. And that's been, that's played out in the courts in several different iterations. And going back to Mayor Mamdani,
yes, please, I want to know.
he's spoken out very vocally in favor of the city's sanctuary laws and in their defense, and very critically of ICE. So we should expect to see him sort of defend the city's sanctuary provisions and not give in.
And are we seeing sort of the widespread street protest movement building in the way it is in Minnesota? I mean, you're just last night watching footage. People are really fighting back, and I think politicians are also starting to fight back against ICE. Is that happening here?
Yeah, we've seen some of the unrest from Minneapolis spread to New York City after the shooting. There's been a few nights of protests, specifically outside 26 Federal Plaza, which is the main ICE offices in Lower Manhattan. And we've seen that over the past year, at different points when there's been flashes of violence in different cities, protests have taken hold in New York. So we saw it when LA happened, we saw it when Chicago happened, and now Minneapolis. So we've seen some of that happening already in New York City.
And you're at the kitchen table with these people who are facing deportation. Can you talk to me about what they're feeling, maybe even a specific case? Somebody, what is it like to be a person who feels hunted right now?
Yeah. I mean, fear is obviously the big emotion. There's a fear that you will go to work and might not come back home, and your kids are at home, or there's no one to pick them up at school. There's a fear of of going outside your home, stepping out, and starting to limit your time outside, making fewer trips to the grocery store, or not going to church on Sunday, because of the fear that you might be apprehended, you might be split up from your family.
I've heard that too, people not leaving the house. That was very startling to me, especially around Christmas time. I was asking people, are you, going to spend time with their family? And they said, not this year, we're going to stay indoors.
Yeah, and it's very palpable, and especially in immigrant-rich communities in Brooklyn and Queens and the Bronx. And even then, I think we haven't hit a crescendo in New York, right? We still haven't seen in New York sort of the drumbeat of steady, large-scale raids like in other cities. The immigration enforcement has been more constrained to the courts and ICE offices. So it's bound to escalate at some point. That's the expectation. And that, I think that fear and that the way that immigrant communities will sort of retreat more into the shadows will become even more clear.
So there's an interesting dynamic in quite a few immigrant families where maybe the first generation person who came over is undocumented, but their child might be a US citizen. And there was a pretty viral video of a kid getting arrested on his way to school with his father in Minneapolis, I believe, and the father ended up being deported. The son was also roughed up. Are these second generation immigrants fighting back on behalf of their parents? Are they also laying low? What is the youth moment here of people who might be American citizens in these dynamic families?
Yeah, I think there has been activism among second generation immigrants, but I think at a more familial level, what there's been a lot of is planning for those situations in terms of like what happens if your father or mother who's undocumented gets detained and your children are US citizens. A lot of families are taught to figure out like a guardianship, who takes custody of the children if the parents are deported. What's the plan, the family's plan if that happens? So we've been seeing a lot of that. And even this week, we had an article in the Times, I didn't write it, a colleague of ours did, about how children of undocumented parents who are US citizens are joining the military or joining the National Guard, because by joining the military or the National Guard, you can get a sort of legal status for your parents, and a pathway for them to stay in the country. But at the end of the day, really, a lot of it is out of their hands, right? I think a lot of people are being more cautious about how they manage their time outside, and then just being prepared for a scenario where they're separated.
Well, it sounds like a growing issue in complexity, and with Trump sites trained firmly on sanctuary cities like New York, I imagine we'll have to have you back on to discuss a lot more of this. Thank you so much, Luis. For the New York Times and CUNY TV, I'm Sarah Maslin Nir. If you'd like to support more programs like this, please consider donating at the link on your screen. Thank you for watching.